So this is a version of a talk that I've given a few times before to some of the graduate students and presidential fellows students, and it originally was in connection with a contest that the graduate students were doing called the 3-minute thesis competition, which was all about sort of forcing students to think in very minimalistic terms about how do you present what it is you do in bare bones, and how do you do it to an audience of people who don't understand your field. So that's really what I want to focus on today, is talking about sort of, how do you talk to your parents, how do you talk to friends who think you're really smart because you have a PhD, but who have absolutely no idea why. Who have no idea what research it is you're doing, why that research is valuable, and more importantly, for most of us, all of us, if you're on the job market, if you're moving toward the job market, anytime you're in an interview situation, you will spend a lot of time with people in your discipline. You will spend a lot of time talking to people who speak your language, but you will also spend time with people who don't. You will talk to deans, you will talk to provosts. I've been in interviews at a small college where I ended up sitting with the university president for half an hour. And these are people who are very smart, they're well educated, they have no idea what you do. They have no idea why it's valuable. Sometimes, worst case, they think they know what you do because they think they have some sense and no idea. And you have to explain to them not just what it is you do, but why you're valuable. In other words, what you can bring to their university, because you have to sell them on that before they can turn around and start selling you on what they can bring to you. So my field is in speech and in rhetoric, and so I'm going to draw a little bit on the language of rhetoric and the rhetorical tradition to talk through this. The ancient Romans had a 5-part structure that they applied to the construction of speeches. Those 5 parts were invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And I'm going to use that 5-part structure to sort of walk us through how you take and you construct a speech. And when I'm thinking speech, I'm thinking anything from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. Something short, something meaningful, something where you have to cut out everything that's detailed. And you have to get to the heart of what is it you do. Why is it valuable, and why should it be valuable to the person that you're talking to? So this can be anything from bumping into someone you want to impress, a coffee line at a conference, to having to have a conversation with someone during a job interview type situation. All right, so invention. This has to do with putting together the bare elements of what it is you're going to talk about. And this always starts with a sense of your audience. Who is it you're speaking to? One of the basic principles of what I do in rhetoric is that the audience is always going to be at the forefront. Speech changes depending on who you're talking to. You can't just memorize a version of here's what I do, package it, and deliver it. Because it will sound like you memorize something, you deliver it. It sounds like you're not talking to the person, you don't really care about the person, and no one responds to that well. So you have to think about, what does your audience want? What do they want in general, and what do they want from you? Since we are, I think, certainly in my field, and I suspect in a lot of yours as well, we are used to thinking in terms of where do we fit? What is our research area? How do we fit in with everybody else? These kind of speeches, these kind of presentations are about thinking in terms of what is your value. What is it that you uniquely bring? What are you good at? Why are you good at it? How does that help the person? Something that I think is difficult for some of us because we get so ingrained and so fixated on the particularities of our field that we forget that despite the fact that a PhD has, in some ways, very little meaning in the context of the university, because everyone who's doing research has one, it's actually a fairly big deal. That thing that is really impressive to your family and friends is actually really impressive. You worked really hard, and you are, in fact, experts at what you do. And this is a moment when you have to sort of step back and remind yourself and remind the person you're talking to about that. What does your audience know? So what is their expertise? And typically, when you're preparing this kind of speech, you want to assume your audience knows very little. You want to assume that your audience knows really nothing substantive about what you do. They may know some of the terminology, they may not. And again, some of the more dangerous situations are when people think they know what you're talking about, but they don't at all, because they've heard terminology thrown around. Everyone likes to act smart when they're around smart people, so people will nod their heads, they'll act like they understand you, they will have no idea what you're talking about. And so it's recognizing that the language you use is language that you've picked up through graduate school, through your research, and that language isn't necessarily going to have meaning for someone who hasn't had that experience. What do they believe? So just because someone doesn't know much doesn't mean that they can't have an opinion on it. Certainly those of you in the sciences, I'm sure, know that. People have opinions on all kinds of things that they really had no information on. And that's not just pundits. That's provosts and deans and university presidents too. Everyone thinks they have expertise in an area. And sometimes that expertise is based on opinion. It's not based on any particular experience with the field. And then, why should they care? So when you're talking to someone in your field, they care for a particular set of reasons. What is that thing that you're doing? How are you contributing to the discipline? How are you contributing to the field? Someone outside of your discipline cares for a different set of reasons. Are you going to bring in funding? Are you going to bring in students? Are you going to raise numbers? Are people going to come into your field because of you? What kind of research is going to be done in your field? How is that research going to be marketed? What are you ultimately trying to achieve? And again, I think particularly in the sciences, but in other disciplines as well, we become very, very fixated on the particularity of what you're doing. What is it that you are doing as part of this broad coalition of other researchers who are also doing things? We become fixated on the details. This is the moment when you have to step back from those details and explain in the broader context, what is it that your work and everybody else's work put together are trying to accomplish? So this brings us then to 4 essential questions. And when we move from sort of me standing up here talking to what I think is the far more interesting portion of this, which is you talking to one another, these are the questions that I think are the heart of any attempt to put together a presentation like this. What is your project? What is it that you do? That's actually a really hard question to wrap around, because we do what we do. We don't necessarily describe what we do. What problem are you trying to solve? What question are you trying to answer? What's wrong with the world? The fact that you're doing research presumes that things are imperfect, that we don't have all the knowledge we need, we have problems that still need to be solved. What problems are you solving? And then why is the problem worth solving? This is the big so what question. Yes, it's great, you're doing research, you're spending all this time, you're spending all this effort, why? What is the value that you're bringing? Value isn't just monetary, it isn't just in terms of value, can be measured in a lot of different ways, but you have to figure out what value you're bringing to these problems that exist. And then big picture, how will the world be better? How will your audience's world be better, and how will the world in general be better? This again is stepping back from your own work to think and put it in context. What is it that you are all trying to accomplish? And then as you're going through this, it's really easy to get distracted. As you're going through this process, this invention process, which is basically just putting information in a big pile. In other words, you haven't organized it, arranged it, anything like that. You're just trying to figure out what information is important. You want to keep your focus. So in general, you want to focus on what you're doing right now. It's good to have a 5-year plan. It's good to be able to say, here's where I'm going. But you really want to spend the bulk of your time talking about what is it that you're doing at the moment. What is the research that you're doing and why? And then you spend a little bit of time talking about how you got here and where you hope to go. Again, focus on the big picture. Don't get lost in the details. And then as you're putting all this together, focus on clear, active language. If you sort of lapse into jargon, you've lost it. You've lost the audience. And jargon is fantastic. We'll talk about that in more detail. But jargon is not where you want to go when you're giving this kind of presentation. All right, so you have the material. Put it in a big pile. Now you move on to actually creating, crafting some kind of organized speech presentation. So you're creating a structure. This is one model for a possible structure. It's not the only one. Attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, action. Attention just means how are you going to grab the audience? What are the first words that are going to come out of your mouth? Whether you're standing with someone in a line, whether you're actually formally standing up or sitting down and talking to someone, it's the first thing you're going to say. And this has an awful lot to do with capturing the value. Either the value of the work that you're doing or the significance of the problem that you're trying to address. How are you going to snap the audience's attention? Need. This gets to the problem itself. What needs to be resolved? What question needs to be answered? Satisfaction is how your work is contributing to resolving that need. Visualization, this is that notion of how will the world be better. So imagining what the world will look like once you've solved the problem that you're trying to solve. Obviously, there will still be more problems. That's job security. But the world will be substantively better because of you. That's visualization. What will that world look like? And then action. This is something you use in some cases, not all. How will the audience be involved in that process? So obviously, if you're in a job interview type situation, action is, I would like a job and I'd like a large research fund and I'd like lots of money and lab space so that I can create this wonderful world that I've just described to you. In some cases, action may be something as simple as, can I get your email address so I can send you more information so we can continue a conversation moving forward. But when you're giving this kind of presentation, you want to think of it as an opening. And you want to ideally leave open the possibility of continuing the conversation further on down the line. Worst case scenario, you apply for a job, you interview for a job, you don't get a job. Hopefully you've struck someone's interest during that time so that as you're going through this process, someone's going to remember who you are wherever you wind up. And there are going to be further opportunities for conversation, for collaboration, for everything else down the road. And then from there, you create a basic outline. So the outline is going to be based on the structure, but it's not going to mimic it exactly. Any speech, any presentation is going to have some kind of structure to it. You have some kind of introduction, some way of grabbing the audience, some kind of overall idea of what you're saying. You want to think in minimal terms that build out. So in other words, if you only have one sentence, if you're just running past somebody, and you only have one sentence, introduce yourself. so they'll remember you. What would you say? And then from there, what if you get 2 sentences? What if you get a minute? What if you get 2 minutes? What if you get 3? What if you get 5? You're building from a base of, okay, I know exactly what I'm going to say to capture someone's attention. And then from there, you're expanding out, you're adding detail. But your preview is that capturing moment. Here's what I do in a nutshell. If you leave, if you have to go away, you've at least gotten that much information from me. Main points, if you're doing a slightly longer speech, you have 2 or 3 main points, main ideas, clearly stated. Because again, you don't want to wander. You want it to be clear where you're going. You want it to be clear to the audience where you're going. Because there are a few things that are more frustrating for people if someone just starts talking and they don't know when the person's going to stop or where the person's going. We've all had that experience. We've all sat through those lectures. We've all seen that happen before. You don't want to ever be that person. You don't want to be the person that someone's trying to edge away from. Because that's what they're then going to remember is, okay, that was the pesky person who wouldn't leave me alone. You want to be the person who captures someone's interest so that they want to come talk to you later on. Summary, again, returning to what is most critical. Returning to the 4 questions. And then conclusion. What does the world look like? How will things be better? What can the person you're talking to do in order to make things better? As part of this arrangement process, if you're doing a formal type presentation, you also want to think about how you're going to represent yourself through something like slides, PowerPoint. It's not absolutely essential, but in many cases it's expected if you're giving any kind of formal talk, formal presentation. I'm not going to say a lot in terms of the actual construction. Most of you know how to do that, but I want to say a little bit about the aesthetics in terms of what you want to do to create an effective presentation. You want to keep things simple. You want to focus on the main ideas. You want to leave empty space. You don't want to crowd a slide with information. Please don't use clip art. It really doesn't help you. It distracts, it takes away, it makes it look like you couldn't come up with anything better and you were just trying to fill space. In general, when you're putting stuff up here, good rule of thumb, something I'll tell my students all the time, whatever you put up on the screen is going to be more interesting than you are. So you want this to add to you. You don't want this distracting away from you. Put blank slides in between. This is another general rule of thumb. If you're in business, this is something people do all the time. Whatever's up here needs to be immediately relevant to what you're talking about. If it's not immediately relevant, make it go away. If you've got a chart or a graph or something, and then you move on from it. If you have another image, great, put it up. If you don't, put in a black slide. Something that's just going to light the screen so that you can talk and the audience isn't looking over your shoulder at this graph that's no longer relevant to whatever you're talking about. You don't want to skip through stuff so fast that the audience doesn't have time to pay attention to it, but at the same time, you don't want stuff hovering over your shoulder that's conflicting with you. And finally, a general good rule of thumb with all of this. A good PowerPoint type slide should never be able to replace you. In other words, sometimes when we're doing lectures, for example, we might put together a PowerPoint slide that's just a straight bullet point of the lecture that you're doing. It might have all the points. You could print it off, and a student who didn't come to class could simply take your PowerPoints, read through it, and they would have everything that you said in the lecture. In this kind of talk, you absolutely never want to do that. The words that you choose should add to what you're saying, but they should not be able to replace what you're saying. The audience should not be able to look at the slide and simply read off your lecture notes, because then they're going to be reading, they're not going to be listening to you. I wanted to throw up just a couple of examples of what I thought were some interesting approaches, interesting ways of putting together a slide. So this is an intro slide for a presentation. Again, I'm less concerned about the actual content than I am about the style. This is a particularly busy style. It's got a lot of words on there. What sets it apart and what makes the busyness a little bit better is that this is a really unique format. It looks different. It's not typical bullet point. This is a very, very basic kind of intro. This is relatively boring. There's not a whole lot here, but at the same time, it gives you the general information. You know where information is going. You know what you're going to be doing in this presentation. You have a kind of clear roadmap. This is a particularly good example of a slide where you don't have to have words. The word slides don't always have to have language on them. This is also a good example of what I was talking about when I say the slide should not replace you. This slide has no meaning without a speaker. But you can imagine a few different directions that a speech might go using a slide like this. It creates an interesting image that can help you as a speaker, but it doesn't replace you as a speaker. And finally, you have something that's, again, relatively simple, relatively minimalistic, takes a basic visual image, uses it effectively, but it doesn't use up all of the available space. It doesn't try to be busier than it needs to be. And then again, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making the image go away. If something isn't relevant, just leave blank space. Keep talking, then come back when you actually have something to talk about. So that was invention, it's arrangement. Next is style. This is the actual words you choose. Think in terms of your language. You want to use active verbs, active nouns. Sometimes in the sciences when we're doing research projects. Sometimes in the humanities too. You're encouraged to distance yourself. You use passive structure deliberately because you're not the one doing everything. You're not the one contributing to everything. You are part of a whole. That whole is doing work. When you're presenting to non-experts, all that goes out the window. You want, you argue, you create, you're changing. What are you doing? That can't be translated back into a research presentation, vice versa. But it's essential if you're talking to a non-specialized audience, because that's what non-specialized audiences expect. They want to know about you. Avoid jargon. Again, jargon is great. Jargon does essential work because it allows us to talk about things more efficiently than we would otherwise, without having to reinvent the wheel every time we talk. But you can't use jargon in this kind of context because it's meaningless to an audience. And typically what happens is jargon becomes a crutch. In other words, we fall back on jargon when we don't quite know how to explain something in simple terms. We can't figure out how to say it, so we fall back on this crutch that is the language that we've learned. You have to define words and names. And this includes recognizing that normal audiences aren't going to understand. They won't have read, they won't have studied, they won't know the names that you're dropping. They might think you're really smart because you have a lot of names to drop, but that's never the point of this kind of presentation. Remember that your fields will often use even ordinary terms in specialized ways. So if the words that you're using have a particular meaning in your field, you have to remember that. You have to remember that just because you say a word doesn't mean that your audience is going to understand the word the way you understand the word. I'm constantly having to remind my freshman students, for example, that in the sciences, theory does not mean what they think theory means. that theory has a specialized meaning.